32%. That was the share of Americans with at least $1 million in investable assets who actually described themselves as wealthy in Northwestern Mutual's 2024 study. Yet that same $1 million translates into $40,000 of first-year portfolio withdrawals under the classic 4% framework, or $47,000 under William Bengen's updated 4.7% historical SafeMax. Neither figure is guaranteed income. Both depend on assumptions about the portfolio, inflation, time horizon, and future markets. But they immediately expose the strange part of the $1 million milestone. The account may have 7 figures, while the lifestyle it can support looks more like $3,333 to $3,917 per month before your individual taxes, investment fees, and account rules. That may be enough to retire comfortably. It may be nowhere close. The balance cannot answer that question until you compare it with the part of your spending that the portfolio must actually cover. And the psychological contradiction did not disappear with time. Northwestern Mutual's 2025 survey found that 36% of millionaires called themselves wealthy. So the latest figure moved slightly higher, but the basic result remained intact. Close to 2/3 of people who had crossed the line still would not apply the label to themselves. That does not prove they are financially insecure. Wealth and security are different ideas. It does show that reaching a widely celebrated number does not automatically produce the emotional state people expect to receive with it. $1 million is impressive as a status number. Retirement forces it to become a cash flow number, and cash flow is where your personal life starts arguing with the headline. If your desired lifestyle costs $90,000 a year, and dependable income outside the portfolio covers $50,000, your portfolio has a $40,000 annual job. $1 million at 4% matches that job on paper. If dependable income covers only $30,000, the portfolio must produce $60,000. The same million now faces a 6% demand. That is a completely different retirement problem, even though the brokerage statement has not moved by a cent. So there are 2 errors available here. You can assume $1 million must be enough because it sounds large, or you can assume it cannot be enough because it no longer feels rich. Both errors skip the conversion from wealth into required income. The fair test is conditional. When your annual spending requirement exceeds what the assets can credibly support, you have a financial shortfall. When the requirement is already funded but you remain unable to take the planned withdrawals, the unresolved problem is more likely to involve framing, uncertainty, or permission. That distinction matters because the treatment is entirely different. A funding gap may require more assets, lower spending, additional income, or a later exit. A permission gap does not automatically improve when you add another $1 million. If the finish line has no definition, a larger account gives your anxiety a more expensive object to guard. Before making that diagnosis, the withdrawal numbers need a credible basis. It came from actual historical research. In 1994, financial planner William Bengen published an analysis of market returns and inflation beginning in 1926. His question was practical. What initial percentage could a retiree withdraw, increase with inflation in later years, and still avoid exhausting a tax-advantaged portfolio during every 30-year historical period he examined? The original result was approximately 4.15%. The public version was rounded to 4%, which is how $1 million became $40,000 in the first year. The inflation adjustment is essential. The framework does not mean withdrawing 4% of whatever the account happens to be worth every January. It begins with a dollar amount based on the starting portfolio, then increases that dollar amount as consumer prices rise. If your first withdrawal is $40,000 and inflation is 3%, the next withdrawal would be approximately $41,200 under the original protocol. The account value might rise or fall, but the spending target attempts to preserve purchasing power. I built a digital book called The Exit Code around this exact transition from owning a large balance to having a usable exit plan, including how a rigid withdrawal rule can distort the decision. You can find it through the link in the description. That original research also did not promise that your portfolio would remain at $1 million. Success meant the hypothetical portfolio did not reach 0 before the end of the tested period. finishing year 30 with $1 technically passed, finishing with several million dollars also passed. Those are wildly different experiences hidden behind the same word, success. This is why I spend so much time reading the boring research rather than repeating the attractive percentage. A rule without its assumptions is usually where useful finance advice goes to become a bumper sticker. By the way, subscribing helps a lot if this kind of document reading saves you from doing it yourself. So thanks to everyone who clicks it. Bengen's 4.15% finding was tied to a particular set of historical assets, an inflation-adjusted withdrawal pattern, a 30-year horizon, and tax-advantaged accounts. Taxes outside the study still matter to you. $40,000 leaving a Roth account does not produce the same spendable result as $40,000 leaving a traditional retirement account, and neither necessarily matches a withdrawal from a taxable brokerage account with a mixture of gains and cost basis. Fees also come from somewhere. A 1% annual advisory fee on $1 million begins around $10,000. Whether that cost is charged separately or removed from the portfolio, it affects the resources available to support your life. A withdrawal percentage quoted before, cost can feel noticeably smaller after the machinery has been paid. None of this makes the framework useless. It makes it a measuring instrument rather than a promise. Bengen continued expanding his historical research by adding asset classes, testing different allocations, and examining more retirement periods. In 2025, he described 4.7% as his updated universal SafeMax under the assumptions of that broader research. On $1 million, the move from 4% to 4.7% adds $7,000 to the first year withdrawal. That is nearly $584 per month. Methodology has now changed whether you can afford a recurring expense, take an additional trip, help a family member, or cover a portion of health insurance. But SafeMax means the maximum rate that survived the historical scenarios being tested. It does not mean 4.7% is personally appropriate for every retiree beginning in 2026. History gives you evidence about what happened. It does not sign a contract with the next 30 years. Bengen himself emphasizes that the personal rate depends on variables, including retirement length, inflation, market valuation, asset allocation, withdrawal design, and legacy goals. 4.7% is therefore more useful as evidence that the familiar 4% number is not a law of physics than as permission to copy the largest available rate. The withdrawal dial can move, but time controls how far. A traditional retirement beginning around 65 may need to cover 30 years or longer. Social Security has long warned that roughly 1 in 4 people reaching 65 lives beyond 90. For a couple of that age, commonly used actuarial estimates put the chance that at least one partner reaches 90 at roughly half, with some estimates around 53% depending on the assumptions. That means planning to 90 is not an extreme longevity scenario for a couple. It is near the middle of the range they must take seriously. If you retire at 55, a 30-year plan only reaches 85. If you stop at 50, it ends at 80. Early retirement does not change the arithmetic because the universe disapproves of free time. It changes the arithmetic because the portfolio must absorb more years of inflation, withdrawals, market cycles, and unknown expenses. In one 50-year scenario Bengen published, the lowest historical SafeMax was approximately 4.2%. Applied to $1 million, that means about $42,000 in the first year rather than $47,000. Notice how useful that comparison is. The difference between a 30-year historical framework and a 50-year illustration is not an abstract debate about whether retirement advice is too conservative. It is $5,000 of annual spending capacity on the same balance. Longer horizons therefore validate part of the anxiety. So do uncertain health costs, the possibility of poor returns early in retirement, and the fact that one member of a couple may need the portfolio for years after the other dies. Calling every concern irrational would be lazy analysis. The real question is whether the concern has a boundary. A reserve for an unexpected expense can be estimated. A legacy goal can be stated in dollars. A longer life can be tested across a longer planning horizon. Discretionary spending can have a rule for difficult markets. More has no boundary. And once safety is defined as having more, rather than funding a known requirement, the target becomes vulnerable to comparison. Charles Schwab's 2025 Modern Wealth Survey captured this split rather beautifully. Americans said a personal net worth of approximately $839,000 was enough to be financially comfortable. The amount required to be considered wealthy was approximately $2.3 million. Those survey figures measure net worth, not investable retirement assets. Your home, business interests, debts, and other property can all affect net worth without producing spendable portfolio withdrawals. So $839,000 is not a national retirement target, and $2.3 million is not a mandatory admission fee to the wealthy club. The useful information is the distance between the two answers. Comfort sat below $1 million. Wealth sat almost $1.5 million above comfort. One describes a condition you can live inside. The other describes a social label. The wealth number also moved. It was approximately $1.9 million in 2021, $2.5 million in 2024, and $2.3 million in 2025. In the latest survey, 63% said being wealthy required more money than it had a year earlier, even though the average number reported by the survey had fallen slightly. That apparent contradiction makes sense once you stop treating rich as an engineering specification. People respond to prices, headlines, housing costs, their neighbors, the market, interest rates, and the visible lifestyles around them. The benchmark is partly comparative, which allows it to move even when the lifestyle you personally want has not changed. Your $1 million may remain fixed, while the cultural finish line slides from 1.9 million to 2.5 million and back to 2.3 million. If that moving line controls your permission to retire, the portfolio can never deliver closure on its own. The withdrawal dial reveals the cost. At 2%, a $1 million portfolio provides $20,000 during the first year. At 3%, it provides $30,000. At 4%, it provides $40,000. Those are not recommendations. They are the consequences of 3 decisions made against an identical account. The person choosing 2% gives up $20,000 of annual cash flow relative to the 4% framework. Over 5 years before inflation adjustments and investment effects, that is $100,000 that remained in the portfolio instead of becoming time, comfort, generosity, travel, or the ability to stop working. That may be a rational trade. Perhaps the owner wants a large inheritance. Perhaps other household risks are unusually high. Perhaps the retirement horizon is exceptionally long. Perhaps spending needs are already fully covered and the additional money has no useful destination. But if the owner actually needs $40,000, the choice to permit only $20,000 changes whether retirement looks affordable. That perceived affordability changes whether leaving work feels safe. And that sense of safety decides whether stopping creates freedom or a new full-time job monitoring the account. Actual retiree behavior gives us a way to test whether this is merely theoretical. The traditional economic expectation is that people accumulate assets while working, then gradually spend those assets during retirement. Researchers use the phrase retirement savings puzzle for the observation that many retirees do not behave that way. They preserve a surprisingly large share of their assets, and some finish retirement with more than they had near the beginning. The Employee Benefit Research Institute examined households using the long-running Health and Retirement Study. Its 2018 report found that retirees beginning with at least $500,000 in non-housing assets had spent a median of only 11.8% of those starting assets after approximately 20 years. Not 11.8% each year, 11.8% across roughly 2 decades. That leaves about 88.2% of the starting asset value unspent at the median after a period long enough to contain a substantial portion of retirement. Households beginning with between $200,000 and $500,000 had spent a median of 27.2% over approximately 18 years. The group with more assets had preserved a larger proportion even though it had more financial room to spend. About 1/3 of the retirees in that earlier sample ended the observation period with more assets than they had near retirement. Their portfolios had not merely avoided depletion, they had grown while retirement was happening. The latest EBRI update, released in 2026, adds useful nuance. It followed households as far as 21 to 22 years after retirement. Median non-housing assets did decline, including a 42% median decline for the high asset group. So the accurate conclusion is not that every affluent retiree refuses to spend. The puzzle is the size of the persistent preservation group. Among high asset households, 42% still had at least 80% of their starting assets after more than 2 decades, and 31% had 100% or more. Among middle asset households, 48% retained at least 80%, while 43% finished with at least as much as they began with. The portfolio was clearly doing something other than paying retirement expenses for a large share of these households. And that changes the meaning of the entire story. The question is no longer only how much $1 million portfolio can safely distribute. It is what psychological job the balance has acquired that prevents the owner from using the distribution the plan already permits. Knowing the historical withdrawal numbers and building a system you can actually follow are two very different things. I built a digital book called The Exit Code, an analysis of 50 years of retirement data distilled into a mathematical framework for exiting the rat race. It deals directly with the 4% trap and the dynamic withdrawal method that replaces a frozen spending rule with a plan that can respond to conditions. It also examines the unretirement paradox, where people return to work even when the money was not the reason the exit failed. The purpose is to turn, maybe someday, into a specific number and a usable date, rather than another optimistic calculator result you cannot emotionally act on. You can get it for less than a dinner out through the link in the description. Every extra year of delay has a mathematical cost, whether the delay comes from underfunding or from never defining enough. The unresolved question is why the balance becomes so difficult to touch. EBRI asked retirees about their reasons for preserving assets, and fear of running out was real, but it was not the most frequently reported motive. 38% wanted the money available for an unforeseen cost later in retirement. 37% felt that spending down the assets was unnecessary. 33% wanted to leave as much as possible to heirs. 31% said they felt better when account balances stayed high. Fear of running out was cited by 27%. Those answers sound different, but they all assign additional responsibilities to the same dollars. Your portfolio is expected to produce income today. It is also expected to serve as protection against unknown future costs, preserve an inheritance, and maintain the emotional satisfaction of visible financial progress. Then, you withdraw $1. That dollar no longer supports current income, the emergency reserve, the future legacy, or the reassuring account balance. Spending appears to damage 4 objectives at once, even when the withdrawal was already included in a credible retirement plan. The portfolio is no longer behaving like a resource. It has become a scoreboard, an insurance reserve, a family promise, and a security blanket sharing one account number. Of course, touching it feels consequential. The system trained you for this reaction. During your working life, an increasing balance usually meant progress. A declining balance could signal failure, poor investment performance, or excessive spending. You watch the number rise for decades and receive a small emotional reward each time it reached a new milestone. Retirement then asks you to interpret a planned decline as success. That is not a small adjustment. The transaction looks identical on the statement. Money leaves the account. Your brain has to decide whether that withdrawal represents a functioning retirement plan or damage to a lifetime of work. After more than 10 years running my own business, surrounded by accountants and fiscal lawyers, I have seen how uncomfortable this transition is, even for people who understand the math. I also have multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars invested, so I understand the emotional difference between discussing a percentage and watching real money leave an account you spent years building. Your nervous system sees a number moving in the wrong direction. A higher balance can temporarily calm that discomfort, but the relief disappears if each milestone creates a new minimum that must never be crossed. $1 million becomes the floor. Then $1.2 million becomes the floor. After a good market year, $1.4 million becomes the number you are unwilling to fall below. The account grows. yet the amount available for life does not. You have increased wealth without increasing usable wealth. This does not mean the reserve, inheritance, and longevity concerns should be ignored. It means each concern needs its own definition. An unexpected cost reserve becomes plannable when you decide what kinds of costs it covers, how large it should be, and whether it is allowed to replenish after good years. A legacy goal becomes measurable when you name the amount or percentage you hope to leave. A longer horizon becomes manageable when the withdrawal framework reflects 50 years rather than 30. A concern without a number can demand everything. If your rule is never let the account decline, the portfolio is not funding retirement. Current income from Social Security, pensions, work, or other sources is funding retirement, while the investment account remains a protected monument. There is nothing inherently wrong with that choice if preservation is your actual goal. The mistake is claiming your goal is freedom while measuring success only by how much remains unused. By the way, subscribing is one of the easiest ways to support the research on this channel, so thank you if you have already done that. The permission gap becomes visible when you place two withdrawal rates beside each other. Assume your $1 million portfolio and your planning assumptions support a 4% starting withdrawal. That gives you $40,000. Yet you feel able to take only 2%, which gives you $20,000. Your supportable withdrawal and your permitted withdrawal are now separated by $20,000 per year. If your retirement spending gap is $20,000, that restraint causes no practical shortage. The portfolio provides the amount required, and the rest remains invested. If your spending gap is $35,000, the emotional limit creates a $15,000 apparent deficit. You may conclude that retirement is impossible, even though the supportable amount under the stated framework exceeds the actual requirement by $5,000. The portfolio is not short. Permission is. This is also why a withdrawal rate alone cannot create safety. A fixed percentage printed in a financial plan does not tell you how to behave after a market decline, a burst of inflation, an unexpected expense, or several unusually strong years. The standard 4% interpretation is rigid. You choose a first-year amount, increase it with inflation, and continue according to the protocol. That rigidity is useful for historical testing because researchers need consistent rules. Real households can make decisions. An adjustable plan begins with a starting rate, but it also recognizes which expenses are essential and which are discretionary. If markets perform poorly early in retirement, the discretionary portion can rise more slowly, pause, or temporarily decline. If the portfolio performs well and the funded position improves, spending can increase without pretending every gain must remain untouched forever. This does not remove sequence of returns risk. It gives you a response to it. The frightening version of retirement says you must select the perfect rate before leaving work, then trust that one decision for several decades. The operational version says you select a defensible starting point, monitor whether the portfolio remains able to fund the remaining spending gap, and adjust the flexible part of your lifestyle before a manageable deviation becomes a crisis. That ability to respond changes the emotional meaning of a withdrawal. You are no longer opening a valve and hoping the lake lasts. You are managing a flow whose rate can change as information changes. There is an important trade-off. Flexibility increases the amount you may be able to spend, but it means accepting that discretionary spending will not be identical every year. A rigid low withdrawal provides steadier spending and stronger preservation, but it may leave a large portion of the portfolio unused. The right choice depends on what you value. The mistake is treating maximum preservation as the automatic definition of safety, when your real goal may be maximum sustainable life. Now, the personal enough number can finally be calculated. Start with the amount you want to spend each year. Remove the dependable income that does not need to come from the investment portfolio. The remainder is your annual portfolio-funded spending gap. If you want $70,000 of annual spending and expect $30,000 from dependable outside income, the portfolio has to fund $40,000. Required investable assets equal that annual gap divided by the planned withdrawal rate. At 4%, $40,000 divided by 0.04 equals $1 million. The portfolio and the requirement match. Under Bengen's 4.7% historical framework, $40,000 divided by 0.047 equals approximately $851,000. That does not mean $851,000 is guaranteed to fund your retirement. It means the historical assumptions supporting 4.7% produce that arithmetic result. The difference between those frameworks is approximately $149,000 of required starting assets. That is why the rate matters so much. A small looking change after the decimal point can move a retirement date by years. Now change the spending requirement. Suppose your desired annual lifestyle is $90,000 and dependable outside income is $30,000. The portfolio gap is $60,000. At 4%, you need $1.5 million. With $1 million, you are short by $500,000 under that framework. This is not a brain problem disguised as a money problem. It is a real mismatch between the income required and the assets available. The title does not mean every millionaire can retire. It means the presence of anxiety does not prove another $1 million is necessary. Take another household wanting $80,000 of annual spending with $50,000 covered by dependable income. The portfolio must produce $30,000. At 4%, the required investable assets are $750,000. If that household owns $1 million, it has a $250,000 margin above the calculated requirement. If the owner still refuses to withdraw $30,000 because the balance might fall below 7 figures, the issue is no longer whether the account can fund the stated lifestyle under the assumptions. The $1 million identity has become more important than the income it was built to provide. You can diagnose this with 2 comparisons. Compare your required investable assets with your actual investable assets. That tells you whether the plan is funded on paper. Then compare the annual withdrawal your plan permits with the annual withdrawal you are genuinely willing to take. That reveals whether the money is usable. When actual assets fall below required assets, the shortfall is financial. When actual assets exceed the requirement, but willingness remains below the planned withdrawal, you have identified a permission gap. There may still be a rational reason for that gap. Perhaps the legacy amount has not been included. Perhaps a major health reserve is missing. Perhaps the time horizon is wrong. Perhaps taxes and fees reduce the spendable amount more than expected. Add those factors to the calculation, give them numbers, rerun the requirement. If every unnamed concern is allowed to sit outside the model can never generate safety. There will always be another possibility the portfolio has not promised to survive. That is the mildly annoying reality of retirement planning. You cannot eliminate uncertainty. You can only decide how much of your life you are willing to surrender in exchange for reducing it. Working another year lowers some risks. It also consumes 1 year of healthy time and delays every experience the portfolio was supposed to make possible. A more conservative withdrawal protects future spending, but it reduces present spending. A larger legacy helps people later, but the same dollars cannot fully support your life now. These are trade-offs, not errors. They become errors when you refuse to name which outcome you are optimizing. The Schwab comfort number brings the psychology back into focus. Americans place financial comfort at $839,000 of net worth in 2025, below the $1 million milestone. Again, that is not a retirement recommendation, and net worth is not the same as investable assets. It demonstrates that the collective line associated with comfort had already been crossed by someone holding $1 million of investable wealth, while the label of rich remained far away at $2.3 million. If you require the rich label before allowing yourself to feel secure, you have tied retirement to the more mobile and comparative benchmark. If you define security as funding a specific spending gap with a credible reserve and an adjustable plan, the target becomes personal and finite. Your definition of enough influences the withdrawal rate you are willing to use. That rate determines the annual life your portfolio can support. The quality of the plan determines whether that spending feels safe. And that feeling decides whether retirement becomes freedom or merely a larger account you now have more time to monitor. Lazy investing built more fortune than crypto memes. The harder skill is recognizing when that fortune has finished accumulating for someday and is ready to perform the job you gave it. your $1 million does not need to make you feel rich. It needs to fund the gap between the life you want and the dependable income already coming in. Once that number is funded, another million may improve the plan, but it cannot define enough for you. D, the gap between the life you want and the dependable income already coming in. Once that number is funded, another million may improve the plan, but it cannot define enough for you.